There are so many things about a PhD that people don't want to admit. And the first one is that it can be an incredibly anxiety and depression-inducing journey. Now, we're getting better at talking about these things, and I think social media plays a part in allowing people to express how they're really feeling. But ultimately, you cannot tell your other PhD students or your supervisor that you're really struggling unless you have a very close and supportive supervisor and research team. Now, the thing is that a PhD journey is full of pushback, it's full of criticism, it's full of self-doubt, and those things can just lay the foundations and build upon each other for a real sort of like depressive episode. And things not working, like you are at the front of a research field and things not working sort of feeds into the fact that you're not good enough, or that you feel like you're not clever enough to do this thing, that there's the imposter syndrome, there's constant criticism from your supervisor about how to do things, that you're not doing things right, and that can really, really hurt. One thing I would say is that you need to seek help, you need to speak to people if you're feeling genuinely depressed, and it's all about self-care. I think a lot of times we don't like to admit as well that we need a lot more self-care than we actually give ourselves. All right, stay around to the end because I delve deep and I've got 9 more things that people don't want to say when they're a PhD student or admit to. One thing that I never admitted to is the fact that I actually trained myself throughout a PhD to turn 3 hours worth of work into what looked like a week or 2 weeks worth of work. Now, that didn't always kind of like play out. Sometimes you do need the full 2 weeks just to like fail again, succeed. But I sort of started to understand throughout my PhD that if I did this series of experiments by, focusing on what worked, I could spend about 3 hours in the lab doing stuff, and then I could turn that into graphs, tables, different experiments, different hypotheses, different schematics, and make it look like I've been working hardcore for a full 2 weeks. And now I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I think a PhD does show you that if you really get good results and you double down on what's working, you can actually turn that into a range of different multimedia for your weekly or your monthly presentations. I preferred fortnightly presentations, and if I was lucky and if I sort of like focused on what was working, I could really convince my supervisor that I was working super hard when in fact I did it all in about an afternoon. This video is brought to you by my newsletter. Go check it out at andrewstopeton.com.au/newsletter. I'll put a link in the description. When you sign up, you'll get 5 emails over about 2 weeks. Everything from the tools I use, the podcasts I've been on, how to write the perfect abstract, and more. Go sign up for exclusive content only on that email list. It's completely free. I'll see you over there. When you're doing your PhD, you are not doing it in isolation. And I had a series of different colleagues that were working on sort of projects that were adjacent to mine, and I got incredibly jealous when they got results that was praised by the team leaders, by the research supervisors, and it's just a natural part of, I think, this kind of semi-competitive area where doing research is a huge kind of luck driven game, and then when people get lucky, you're like, why wasn't I lucky? I'm clever, I'm all these other things. And I used to get insanely jealous if people were getting great results, but ultimately I kind of had to sort of like reposition my narrative around this and just say, you know what, them getting great results means that I can learn from them, or them getting great results means that I can push my results a little bit better because they've proven that they can do it. And it's a tough mindset to get rid of, but jealousy never helped anything. But it's something that I think I didn't like admitting. It was that I was jealous because maybe they were just getting the attention of the supervisor, which brings me on to my next point. Supervisors have pet projects. Now, if they are supervising a range of PhD students, at some point, because of the luck factor and because, they may have worked on something particularly interesting that worked really well and it kind of boosts the supervisor's career. They'll look at that and that will become the pet project. That will be something that they're like, yes, I want to talk about this. I'm getting excited about this. I'm going to talk to the university about this. This is the thing. And at one point, I was the pet project and I loved it. I loved the attention. I loved the fact that they were super enthusiastic. And, eventually the pet project moved on to another one. But ultimately, being the pet project meant that I got attention, that, I was praised more often than I was criticized, which is something that's quite hard to find in academia. And I really did like it. And I did kind of feel at that moment that everything was going to go right, that I was going to be okay. In fact, my research made it on the New Inventors program that was presented by the research leader, Dr. or Professor Paul Dastor. And ultimately, being the pet project was just wonderful. And it was all of the praise and stuff that you got when you were an undergraduate that you kind of missed out when you're doing research, and it all came flooding back. Oh, being the pet project is the best, but it sucks when you're not the pet project because the reverse is true. Another thing PhD students don't like to admit is that at some point during their PhD, they start to think that their supervisor is an absolute idiot. Now, this may not hold true for everyone. It may not be as extreme, but there are moments where I was listening to my supervisor, and because I am the most connected to my research, I thought, that won't work. That won't work. I've tried that. We talked about that last week. We tried this 6 months ago and that was rubbish. You're an idiot. And it's not that they're an idiot. It's just that they haven't been, at least in the sciences, in the chemistry sort of like area that I was in, they haven't been in the lab for years. The only time they enter a lab is they put a lab coat on, which is normally like nice and clean. They go in for photo opportunities with the press, with the university media team. That's the only time I saw my supervisor in the lab, or if they kind of wanted to walk through. When I first started, my PhD supervisor was like, oh, I may just sort of like rock up in the lab every Friday and do a bit of research. That never eventuated. That never happened. And that's because they're busy doing other stuff, getting grant funding, sort of like crying in their office with the doors closed, stress eating, consuming ice cream to sort of like, limit the feelings they need to feel about their own career choices. But ultimately, these people are not in the lab. And there's a moment where you get so connected to your research and you are genuinely the person that knows the most about your research. When they start suggesting stuff, you're like, you are an idiot. Another thing that I would never admit is that the politics are so easy to get sucked into. Now, I've tried my best to always stay outside of politics, outside of allegiances and rivalries, but it's tasty. I think that's why like the soap opera effect comes into play in any sort of workplace is, ultimately it's a little bit boring going to the same place every single day to do the things that you've always done that didn't work in the past, that you hope will work in the future in the case of research. And then if something juicy pops up, it just consumes you because you're like, oh, this is far more interesting than going to the lab and cleaning the glassware or sitting down in front of my computer and doing that little bit of data analysis I wanted to do. This is what I want to do. So yes, even though I tried my best to stay out of it, the politics are just so juicy and the gossip flows. There's a point during your PhD project where it is so boring to talk about. There is no doubt that there is a point, maybe 2, 3, 4 years in, where you're like, I just don't want to talk about this anymore. I've talked about it on papers, I've talked about it in presentations, I've talked about it on posters at conferences, I've talked about it to my family, my friends. They're bored of it, and I'm super bored of it. And it's about being able to push through those feelings and still turn up, still sort of like push towards those final results that will get you that thesis. But there's a moment where you are so bored by your own research that you would just do anything not to talk about it. And then, of course, all those feelings come like, well, am I doing the right thing? If I really don't like it, then should I be following this PhD career path? And ultimately, you do come out the other side, but it is so boring sometimes that the worst thing you to do and the last thing that you want to do is do more research on this question that just doesn't seem to ever let you think about anything else. The one thing about becoming a PhD student is that as you specialize, you become more of an idiot about things that you used to actually know a lot about. I remember being in my sort of like second or third year, and I remember just thinking back to my master's or my undergraduate and being like, wow, I knew a lot about quite a broad variety of chemistry subjects, and now I've completely forgotten all of the stuff. And sometimes it sort of like popped its ugly head because I was like, oh, I need that really fundamental thing that I learned in first year chemistry, but I've completely forgotten it. And this is where, when I did my postdoc, lecturing actually sort of like made me connect again with the foundations of the chemistry that I was meant to know. But because I specialized so much, I just completely forgot about it. And you can feel like an absolute idiot when you're talking to undergraduates as well, because I remember once I gave a tutorial and they were like, well, what about this? And I was like, I do not remember that at all. I'll get back to you. But it's about being cleverer by knowing much more about much less, which in the end, doesn't that just balance out? Anyway, you certainly start to feel dumber. No one likes to admit that. Another thing is that the future is incredibly scary. In fact, as a PhD student, it's much easier just to focus on worrying about what's happening in the lab, getting your thesis, getting that next paper, rather than sort of zooming out and looking at the grand plan for your career or what you want to do in the future. And unfortunately, it happens far too late for a lot of PhD students where they don't actually zoom out and say, well, in 10 years' time, what do I want to be doing? Because hopefully I'll get my PhD, and then what? Am I going to go into academia? But that's so unlikely. What about my career options in industry? What about the other sort of like career options that I've probably ignored until now because I followed this path without really understanding why I was doing it? It was just the easiest path at the time. So thinking about the future is incredibly scary, and we try our absolute hardest not to think about it at all. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of PhD students just tumbling through their careers and life without any real plan. So I'm all about life by design, not by default. And sometimes you do have to take those scary steps, and you have to think about those scary subjects to make sure that you don't end up having PhD regret once you get kicked out the other side and you realize that, oh, I don't know what to do now. Now I'm scared. Another thing that I didn't like to admit to myself during my PhD was that, in fact, I was much better at marketing what I was doing than actually doing what I was doing. And that, I think, laid the foundations for my success, for getting into industry, for also getting into a postdoc and then getting funding. It all comes down to marketing. And I don't think we like to admit that. If you are able to weave a fantastic story about what you are actually doing, that is more likely to lead to success. Now, I've got a couple of examples, which I won't go into the details because you'll be able to figure out who I'm talking about immediately. But essentially, there's two people I used to work with, and they have been able to spin a media storm around their work. And ultimately, what they're doing is quite, it's interesting, but it doesn't deserve the amount of media attention they're getting. And that's because they've been able to weave in all of these amazing hot topics. So what I would recommend you do is, if you can, link your research to a hot topic at the time, talk to your media department, boom, you've instantly got kind of credibility, you've instantly got the ability to attract more attention. With attention comes funding, collaborations, and it just starts from there. So as much as we hate to admit it, some of the people that are successful are not because they've come up with something amazing, but they just know how social media, how media works, and how they can weave an amazing story about their research. And as you go through a PhD, you start to see that more and more often with the people around you. So marketing matters a lot of the time, much more than the science or research. So there we have it. There's everything that I think people don't like to admit while they're a PhD student. Let me know in the comments what you would add to that. And also remember to go sign up to the newsletter. Go check out academiainsider.com. That's my new website where I've got my ebook, The Ultimate Academic Writing Toolkit, which has been getting a ton of great reviews. Thank you so much. And my Insider Forum. All right then, I'll see you in the next video.